So here's some information on general judging, some how-tos and some important notes. Each judging team is going to evaluate one flight of one category. Some of our project categories can be quite large. For example, the exhibits often have 40 or 50 projects in them. I don't want to have a couple of judges evaluate all 40 or 50. So we're going to have some small flights. And in categories with multiple flights, we're going to decide through deliberation and consensus. So you might be assigned one flight of, say, 12 or 14 projects. There might be 3 or 4 other groups looking at 3 or 4 other groups of projects, and you're going to come together and you're going to decide which projects should advance. You're going to use the evaluation forms, which are not really rubrics and they're not score sheets. So when you get together to deliberate and have consensus, just remember that your interpretation of the rubric vocabulary might be slightly different than the other judges. So those evaluation forms should be used as notes, which can then be used to make your final decisions. The judges' final decisions are final. I can't override them. The state director can't override them. So it's really up to you to pick the projects you think are the most deserving to advance to the next category, or to the next level. A few important things before you start looking at the projects. The focus of the project really should be within the last 20 or further than the last 20 years. It's 2020, so it should be pre-2000. 9/11 is really cutting it close at this point. So really think that we want the projects to be further back than the 2000s. Also, some of the projects you're going to disagree with the students' conclusions. We're a diverse region, and there's going to be a diverse opinions, and that means politics as well. That should not factor into your evaluation process. Please do not confront or critique participants about their individual viewpoints, and try to leave your personal opinion about these topics kind of on the side and evaluate it based on that evaluation form. Note also primary sources and secondary sources primary sources are of that history, secondary sources are about that history. There are only 2 things that will disqualify a project. One is obvious plagiarism. That includes self-plagiarism. They're not allowed to use a project they've used in the past. And the other is interfering or harming with another student's project, but we don't really have to deal with that this year since we're all virtual. Every project needs to have a couple of pieces of paperwork. The first is a title page. Even the papers this year will need a process paper, and they all need an annotated bibliography. And a title page is going to look like one of these. Each category is slightly different. If you have a website, the website's going to look like this up here. It's going to have that information: papers, exhibits, performances, documentaries. They all have slightly different information needed on them because they all have slightly different ways of submitting the work. Also note that junior division is 6th through 8th grade. Senior division is 9th through 12th grade. So we have the 2 different divisions there. A process paper is 500 words maximum. It does not have to be exactly 500 words, and it can't go over that. If it goes over by a word or 2, you're going to want to mention that to the person, but it's going to be less than 500 words. It's not allowed to have quotes or images or captions this year. It's not part of the word count for the different categories, so it's its own separate word count, but it has to answer these 5 questions. How did they choose the topic? How does it relate to the annual theme? How did they conduct the research? How did they create the project? What's the historical argument? And in what ways is it significant to history? You're going to notice a lot of overlap with what they're supposed to tell you in the project, and that's okay. If you have any questions, look at the process paper, and that should help you out. The other thing that often comes up here is whether it should be one essay or if they can write the questions and then answer the questions below. It doesn't really matter either way. The annotated bibliography is kind of like a works cited page, but they are not limited to only referenced items. So they're going to have all of their cited works. It can be in APA style, MLA style, or Tiberian, I believe. Usually if they're consistent, they're doing it in a particular way. It's not a big deal. Separated by primary and secondary sources. So they're going to have one list of primary sources and a second list of secondary sources. There isn't a required number in either of the categories, but what we're looking for is balance. So roughly similar numbers of primary and secondary sources. You don't want to have all secondary and just a couple primary, for example. For each one of the citations, because this is an annotated bibliography, they're going to have the citation, and then below the citation, they're going to explain how they use the source and how it helped them to understand the topic for every source. New this year is that the annotations can only be 2 to 3 sentences long. We want to see that they have a variety of sources. For example, not just all websites, not just all books, not just all Googled articles. We want to have a mixture there. And watch out for fluff. Sometimes students will find primary sources and they'll find like 10 pictures from one book, and they'll cite each individual picture to make their bibliographies look longer. That is not disqualifying, but just be careful that sometimes that happens, and you're going to want to mention that in the comments. Okay. So those are the general rules for some of the judging information.